Good evening. I'm Bob Stein, chair of the seminars. Welcome to the final seminar of 2016. It's really been a wonderful season. I hate to have it end. We've had really excellent and timely presentations, and including tonight, record attendance. Thanks to you all for really making it possible. The videos from our first three are up on our website, seminars@steamboat.org. Today's will be up in about 10 days, and will also be broadcast on KUNC, Rocky Mountain Public Radio, on August 29th at 9 p.m. We're not resting on our laurels and our successes. We're getting to work, and the board will be getting to work next week to begin planning for 2017, which is our 15th anniversary season. And we hope you will all plan to be with us next year. First, there's a survey that you have there. Two reasons for doing this survey. The first is they haven't figured out a category for us yet in Best in the Boat. So we're going to have to ask our own questions to find out how we are doing. Please fill it out if you have it. You can leave it on the chair at the end. If you didn't get one and want one, raise your hand or get one at the end of the session and let them. What it does, it tells us about you and also gives you a chance to let us know how we're doing. We receive grants from a number of sources which ask about our audience and the service we provide to the steamboat community, so that the surveys really are important. Another question for you all. We have a new start time this year, which is 5:30. How many of you liked it, if you could raise your hand? Anybody who doesn't like it? You're usually not this shy. How many for you doesn't make a difference? Well, good. I would like to thank our sponsors for this evening's seminar. The sponsors are Karen and Joel Piasek. If you are here, raise your hand or stand up. And we have two supporting sponsors, the Yampa Valley Community Foundation, and we are pleased that we are considered part of the community by them, and also Joella West and Larry Klingman. I think I see them over there. As usual, turn off your cell phones. And one last part of this welcome, my thank you. Thank you to all of our volunteers. Those who are ushering have provided excellent service, done so with smiles, helpful information, and I know that you will be getting your questions in to the ushers, who will be looking for you. If it's during the presentation, raise your hand. They'll collect them and get them down to the front. Also, a big thank you to all of our friends. As you know, this would not happen without you, and we are extremely grateful. You deserve a round of applause, if not for yourself, for the person sitting next to you. I would like to thank the board of the seminars, who do a great deal of work, more than many boards. Thank you also to the String staff for their role in letting us use the facility and making sure that the videos work. And finally, to Deb Metcher, our program administrator, without whom very little in the seminars would happen. So thank you. Belle Sawhill is a founder of the seminars and board member and a colleague of our speaker, and she will introduce him.
Thank you, Bob, and wonderful to see all of you. And I'm really pleased that I get to introduce my friend and colleague, Richard Reeves. His bio, which is very distinguished, is in your program, and so we're not going to go over all of that. I will briefly say that he is a senior fellow at Brookings, and also he is a co-director of the Center for Children and Families. And that makes him, by the way, technically my boss, so I have to be careful what I say here. But I think what he would tell you is that I'm a pretty difficult person to manage. And a few years ago, when I was his boss, I would say the same thing about him. And more seriously, the reason we can say that about each other is because we are close colleagues with very similar intellectual and policy interests. Now, Richard has held some pretty high positions in the UK government. He was the top strategist to Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister of Great Britain. And he left the UK in 2013, fortunately before Brexit, to live in the US with his wife, who is American, and who hadn't bargained on having to stay in the UK for quite as long as she did. So this is payback time. I think that you will find that he's a very thoughtful and interesting person on these topics of social mobility and opportunity and inequality. And I can tell you that he has taken the field that he and I both work in by storm, and I would say he is very clearly one of the up-and-coming stars in this particular area. Now, in preparation for having to introduce him, I thought, well, what can I say about Richard that isn't the usual? And so I Googled him to see if anything interesting would come up. And what I found was that the people who most often search for Richard online search for 3 other people. And who are they? One is Adam Smith, one is David Ricardo, and one is John Stuart Mill. And I'm looking at all of this and I'm shaking my head and I'm thinking, my God, Richard, you are in very good company, but they are all a little ancient. And then I thought, well, that's good for me because I'm getting a little older here and maybe it's okay for me to hang out with you as well. Anyway, more seriously, the reason those 3 names were on the Google site was because Richard wrote a award-winning biography of John Stuart Mill. I've read it, or most of it anyway. It's a long book, but it's really, really well done and very, very readable if you're interested in John Stuart Mill. So I can tell you that he is a rising star, as I said before, and I'm very proud to have been somewhat responsible for bringing him both to Brookings and, of course, here to Steamboat. So, Richard, welcome.
Thank you, Belle. Thank you, Belle. Thank you, Bob, and the committee for inviting me, and to the sponsors of this evening's lecture. As you already know from what Belle said, I'm not originally from around here. And one of the challenges that I face as someone who speaks on issues of inequality and social class and the American dream is that I do it in this accent. And so I have to prepare my defenses. So what I say is, well, where I come from, we know a bit about social class. We've been doing social class for a long time in our country. It's one of the reasons, arguably, that you're no longer part of that country. So we know a bit about it. Also, as Belle's mentioned, I'm married to an American. My kids have American passports. I have a green card. And in fact, I even went to the trouble to be born on the 4th of July, which is absolutely true. You can Google that. I'm very relieved Belle didn't find anything else in the Google search. She gave me a moment there. And in fact, 2 weeks from today, I have an interview in Baltimore to see whether or not I can pass the test to become a US citizen. So, mostly inspired by the need to vote in November. I mean, of course, I haven't told you which way I'm going to vote. I went to all the trouble to get a postal vote so I could vote from overseas in Brexit, and look how that turned out. And in fact, when we get to the Q&A, the most helpful thing to me would be is if you know the questions that they ask in the immigration interview, it would be helpful practice to me to go through those. There are things like, name 3 states that border Canada. I can do that. And obviously a very special thank you to Isabel Sawhill, Belle, as I think we all know her. And Belle is the reason I'm here. And not only, as she said, the reason I'm here for tonight's lecture, but the reason why I'm at the Brookings Institution. I was attracted to Brookings, of course, because of its reputation, but because of the work that Belle was doing on intergenerational mobility. I knew Belle's work many, many years before I even came to the US. And through a mutual friend, we were introduced and we got talking about some of these issues. I then ended up doing some work with Belle, being hired by Belle, and then as she just pointed out, I am now her boss. Although she also pointed out you're right to laugh at that idea. But also, and Belle may not even know this, but actually my wife and I came here with no real plan. We just decided it was time to come. It worked in times of the kids were the right age. Neither of us had landed jobs. That's the American way, right? You just come. And then neither of us landed jobs. So it's actually getting a tiny bit perilous. And then fortunately I landed on my feet at Brookings, and then everything since then has gone very well. But it may well have been that if it had taken a bit longer, that I wouldn't actually even still be in the US. So to say that I owe Belle a great deal would be an understatement. And at the risk of praise inflation, I'll say a couple more words about Belle, which is that as a close colleague, and we're taking it in turns to manage each other, her combination of intellectual curiosity, social conscience, and scholarly integrity is inspiring to all the scholars at the Brookings Institution where I work. And so to work as closely as I do with Belle has been a genuine privilege. People very often say that because it's the right thing to say. It's the polite thing to say. I can tell you that I mean it. Belle's quite formidable, though. I don't know how many of you have encountered Belle personally or an intellectual argument, but she's formidable in argument. And I can give you a taste of what that has been like at one remove. You may know that Belle's been perhaps the leading voice in the US for access to affordable and effective contraception for all Americans of all income groups, both in her role in the national campaign to prevent teen and unintended pregnancy, but also in her role at Brookings, and in particular her latest book, Generation Unbound, which is the single best sustained argument for greater investment in effective forms of contraception, and in particular long-acting forms of contraception. There's now just much better contraception around, but too few people know about it or can get access to it, and Belle's argued very strongly and persuasively in favour of that. I found myself on a working group, which was a cross-party working group, so it's all backgrounds, ideologically and politically, and we got stuck on the issue of contraception. It became a very difficult argument. There were some of us who felt very strongly that we should have a big chapter in our report on the need for access to affordable, safe, effective contraception in the US, and who feel that the US is a very long way behind other nations in this regard, and that has huge consequences for all of the individuals concerned, but more broadly for opportunity and inequality, the very things we're going to talk about tonight. So I felt very strongly that we had to talk about this. Belle had come and presented to this group. Belle wasn't on the group. She'd come and presented her case. And I ended up in a very heated argument with a conservative, a social conservative on the group, who was coming at it from a very different perspective, who came at it from a deeply religious perspective. And in the course of this argument, he said to me, "You don't understand what's at stake for me, Richard. When we've written this report and published this report, and it mentions contraception, I will have to go and face my God." And I said to him, "What you don't understand is that when we publish this report, I will have to go and face Isabel Sawhill." And I put it to you that my prospect is scarier than yours. Anyway, it really helped the argument because everybody around the table was like, yeah, that's right. So I'm here to talk about inequality and the American dream. I've thought a lot about the American dream as a new American, hopefully shortly. And it's also the area where Belle and I have done a lot of our joint work. And so what I'm going to do is talk about the American dream in the context of rising inequality. And what does it mean? I'm going to say a bit about what it is. I'm going to say a bit about how we're doing. I'm going to say a bit about what are the barriers to achieving the American dream today. And at the end, I'm going to say a little bit about the nature of inequality and who are the beneficiaries of inequality. And I'm going to suggest, perhaps a tiny bit provocatively, that if we're looking for the face of inequality, many of us at least should be looking in the mirror. This is not just an issue of the plutocrats and the top 1%. It actually includes a lot of us who've done significantly better than perhaps we than we like to admit. So that's where I'm going to end, and I have a book coming out along those themes. I'm also going to play a video, just in case you get bored along the way. Let's start with Horatio Alger, because one of the things that you hear a lot in the US is the Horatio Alger myth, or the Horatio Alger story. Horatio Alger, of course, was the novelist rather than the character. But all of his books were about people who kind of started in poverty and made it. They were always boys. They tended to be shoeshine boys or something similar. They almost always met somebody who became their mentor. And then they made it. They became a lawyer or whatever. And he wrote 100 books in the 19th century. His most famous one was this one, Ragged Dick, from 1868, in which he kind of, one of the characters is explaining to this boy who's basically, he's living on the streets and shining shoes for a living. This is what he said. This is how he captured the American dream. In this free country, poverty in early life is no bar to man's advancement. Save your money, buy your books, and determine to be somebody. It seems to me that's not bad. I mean, as a general principle, Horatio Alger was a terrible writer. Hands up who's actually read anything by Horatio Alger. Good. In the year 2000, he was still the third best-selling American author of all time. He was actually just behind or ahead of Danielle Steele, I think. Now, don't forget, he was only writing in the 19th century. That's not bad. And I have to say that if you put them next to each other, who was a better writer? Danielle Steele was a much better writer. He was a terrible writer. But this actually does kind of capture what we mean, right? Poverty is no bar to your advancement. In this free country, so right there, a bit of American exceptionalism. Poverty in early life, so if you're born poor or you're kind of from poor background, it's no bar. You can rise. But then it says a bit more about how you do that. Save your money, or as economists like to say, accumulate financial capital. Buy books, and if you read them, accumulate human capital, skills, and determine to be somebody, aspiration, drive, etc. So it seems to me there I use this quite a lot because it seems to me it does capture some of the kind of elements of what we mean by the American dream and kind of American exceptionalism. I dug a little bit into, for an essay I wrote for Brookings, dug a little bit into the Declaration of Independence. One of the things about coming to a country is you get interested in the history and where did these myths come from? These kind of, because nations are essentially made up of myths. And so understanding where those myths come from is really important. And of course, this is a famous quote from Jefferson that all men are created equal. We obviously know that wasn't what they meant, or certainly not what they did. But then I discovered something else, which for my purposes is slightly more interesting, is that in his original draft, he actually wrote this. All men are created equal and independent. That was then edited out of subsequent versions, so it went through an editorial process, and those words were taken out. But in the first draft, that's what was written. And it's, in a way, I think something was lost there, because that seems to me to kind of capture this idea of what I call egalitarian individualism, which is this idea that it wasn't just a declaration of independence from my country. It was actually a declaration that you would be a nation of independent people. And so I was asked recently to say, look, if you had to define quintessentially what it meant to be American, I kept finding myself coming back to this phrase of being self-made. People will say things like, she's really made something of herself. She's really made something of herself. That sentence seems to me to capture something very essential about the idea of America. She's made something of herself. So the resources for her success were herself. But then she had to make something of herself. People say that they're self-made here. This is the only country in the world where people don't say how much you earn, but how much do you make, which is weird. But there is this kind of idea of kind of being self-made, and I think it's at the heart. And I also think that it won't probably change anytime soon, and we can perhaps talk about that. But there is this sense of individualism that goes along with egalitarianism. So in theory, everyone's equal, but it's actually up to each individual to make something of their opportunities. So we think there's a responsibility to create opportunities. We also think that you have a responsibility to take those opportunities. That's one of the reasons why class-based politics doesn't do quite so well in the US. As Chris Hayes, who wrote a book and he presents for MSNBC, he said, in America, people rise from their class, not with their class. And I thought it was a very interesting way to kind of put it. There's this sort of sense of meritocracy that's at the heart of it. And I think it was captured right there at the beginning. Now, I'm told that you're an incredibly well-read and learned audience. So I'm going to give you a picture of someone as a little glimpse. The first person to tell me who that is gets a free copy of my book. The second person gets 2 free copies, and so on until they all sell out. In fact, Belle was very nice about my book, although whenever someone says I've read almost all of it, a small part of you dies. I've actually written 3 books, and I used to work for a national newspaper and stuff. And my wife once said to me, someone asked her to describe my career trajectory, and she said that it had been a lifelong search for smaller audiences. and then she added, and largely successful search too. It's kind of true. But anyway, so who knows who this is? Not obviously no. Who's that? Shout out. Elton John, did you say? Well done. Anybody know? Huh? No? No? Come on, people, there's a free copy of my book on the line here. Maybe 2. All right, he's a philosopher, a 20th century American philosopher, possibly the most famous 20th century American philosopher. No, he's a British philosopher, he's amazing. He's my favorite philosopher, by the way, Bertrand Russell, fantastic. Bertrand Russell was once asked, what do philosophers do? And he said, in the morning you make a few distinctions. In the afternoon you clarify a few concepts. It's a living. This is John Rawls, all right? And no one recognizes him because you never saw his picture, right? You might have read Theory of Justice or heard of Theory of Justice, right? And I promise you this is not about to become a philosophy lecture, much though I'd like to talk to you about Rawls and John Stuart Mill for the rest of the evening. But Rawls invented an idea, which is quite an important idea, about social justice, which was the veil of ignorance. And this is what Rawls meant by the veil of ignorance. Basically, the idea of veil of ignorance is that a fair society is one that we would all choose without knowing what place we were going to occupy in that society. So imagine we shut the door, not let anybody out, and we all in this room have to design a fair society, socially just society. But you don't know until you go out there what position you're going to occupy. You don't know how much money you're going to have. You don't know what occupation you're going to have. You don't know what education you're going to have. You don't know anything. You just know it's going to be random. So you're going to walk out there and it's going to be randomized as to where you end up. And then you design the society. And so this idea was, if we didn't know where we were going to end up, what kind of society would we invent? And the basic idea was that behind a veil of ignorance, we would actually create a fairer society and a more equal society than one we have now. Because right now, society is by and large created by people who do know their place in it, and it tends to be a rather comfortable place. And so why would they change very much about it? And I like that, but I've sort of changed it a little bit. I decided to tinker with rules. And so my new formulation is about intergenerational justice. My new formulation is that a fair society is not one where you don't know your own position, because that's hard to think about, where you don't know where your kids are going to end up. So if you don't know whether your children are going to end up at the top or the bottom of the income ladder, maybe they're going to be at the top where they started or the middle where they started, maybe they're going to fall all the way to the bottom, maybe they're going to rely on the safety net, maybe they're going to be reliant on welfare or kind of benefits, maybe they're not, maybe they're going to be millionaires. You don't know, you have no idea. Imagine if you had no idea, would that change the way we thought about the kind of society we created and the kinds of opportunities? My supposition and my argument is that we would, and that one of the problems at the moment is that actually, particularly those of us who are relatively affluent and relatively privileged, we know quite well that our children are likely to do quite well, not least because of all the good things we do with and for our children, as all good parents should. So their risk in life is significantly reduced. And if their risk of ending up poor or needy is less, how strongly will we support those services which are aimed at the poor and needy? Because we not only know that we won't need those services, we're pretty sure our kids won't either. And so this idea of distributional justice is partly based on some sort of sense of, do we know where we're going to end up? All right, that's enough philosophy. Time for some charts. I'm going to make a distinction between two kinds of mobility. So we talk a lot about the American dream in terms of upward mobility. Remember Alger. You can go up as high as you like. There are two ways to think about mobility. I'm only going to talk about one of them tonight. The first is what economists and social scientists call absolute mobility. And that's a measure of, are you better off than your parents were at the same age, roughly the same age? So you're 40 now. Are you better off materially than your parents were when they were 40? Obviously adjusting for the cost of living. Are you better off? Are you in a better situation than your parents were? And these are estimates. Just the top bars are the ones that really matter. These are one of the more recent estimate than another, is that between 2/3 and 4/5 of Americans are better off in material terms than their parents were at the same age. Typically it's in the 30s or 40s. That's almost inevitable if the economy has been growing in the meantime. So whereas air conditioning or the money for air conditioning was a luxury 40 years ago, it now might be seen as essential. And whilst growth has slowed very significantly since the 70s, it's still the case the economy has grown. So most people will be better off than their parents were at the same age. And unless the economy stops growing, you'd expect most people to be at least a bit better off. The question then becomes how much better off? A lot better off, as the baby boomers were, or only a bit better off, as the millennials might be? But nonetheless, this idea of are you overtaking your parents is still quite strong. But there's another way to think about mobility, which is not about are you better off than your parents, but what rung of the ladder are you on compared to where your parents were? So imagine if you're born on the bottom rung of the ladder, your parents are on the bottom rung, do you stay on the bottom rung, or do you go up to the top? And if you're born at the top, do you stay at the top, or is there a chance you might tumble down? So this is what we call relative mobility, and that does require downward mobility if you want upward mobility. And this is a measure of that. Bell and I have some estimates of this as well. This is from a study by Raj Chetty, who has a massive administrative data set. So this is the one I've kind of chosen to present. And this is a quintile transition matrix. We love making these at Brookings. Intergenerational income transition matrices using quintiles. Literally, the days fly by for us. We make these over, and you're about to see a few, so brace yourselves. And what's happening here is we're talking about where the kids were born from left to right. Kids who were born into the poorest quintile, the poorest fifth. So we've just divided the population up into equally sized fifths, or quintiles, as we feel the need to call them. And you've got the poorest ones on the left over to the richest on the right. And then we say, okay, but where did they end up as adults? So I know where they were born. Where do they end up when they're adults? And what this tells me is, of the kids who are born in the bottom 20%, 34% of them stay in the bottom 20%. And only 8% make it to the top. Now, in a world in which there was no relationship at all between where you were born and where you ended up, every single one of these would be 20%. There would be no relationship between where you started and where you ended up. Of course, no society is ever going to be like that. I mean, we wouldn't want it to be. But what this does is it gives you a sense of kind of how sticky is society, how far is where you end up determined by, or at least explained statistically by where you started. And if you look to the top right-hand corner, you'll see that of those who are born into the top quintile, so my kids, or anyone who's kind of in that sort of top 20% of the income distribution, 37% of them are going to stay in that top fifth, and just 11% are going to drop. So there's stickiness at both ends and mobility in the middle, right? So that's a kind of idea of relative mobility. And as I said earlier, if you want people to come up, some people have to come down. It is, to that extent, a zero-sum game, relative mobility. And this is the kind of, we compare countries using this, and I'm now about to compare different groups. Right? This is how sticky is society in terms of mobility. Now, this is me, and you're probably wondering what's happening here. I created a short video in which I tried to explain the basics of relative mobility. Well, I did it through Brookings, a colleague of mine. And it's done reasonably well. By think tank standards, it's a smash hit. And I was very skeptical about this, but I'm going to play it for you. And it's slightly weird. And Belle said she thought it would be okay, so I'm blaming Belle. Slightly weird to play a video of yourself during your own talk. It's sort of a combination of narcissism and laziness. It's like, hey, let's watch me for 3 minutes, because you're already watching me, so let's watch. Anyway, so I can't really justify it, except to say that Belle thought it would work. And I can't see the thing. Can you see the thing? To make it play. Okay, there it is. Thank you very much. So I'm going to play this. Let's see how this goes. If anyone starts to feel it's embarrassing, just shout. No, that's not it. So I clicked on it, but it went the wrong way. And now I'm going the other way. All right, let's try this again. I'm told that if I click here, amazing. Volume, can we hear it?
We're going to talk about inequality and opportunity in America. Let's start by dividing the population up into 5 equally sized slices.
Why would you listen to him? He's
If you're
got a
boring
British
like
accent.
me, you might call them quintiles. In an absolutely equal society where everybody had the same amount of money, each fifth of the distribution would get a fifth of the money. It would look like this. Of course, that's not how it is. In the real world, the bottom quintile, the bottom fifth, gets 5% of the money, and the top fifth get more than half the money. But I think in terms of fairness, and certainly in terms of American fairness, the question's less what's the gap between the bottom and the top, and it's more what are your chances of...
So I'm just playing with technology now. Because I just said that in terms of fairness, and I said very quickly, in terms of American fairness. So just slip that in there. And because I said it so quickly and badly, I feel the need to point that out. Because I'm making a very strong point there, which is in America, it's about mobility. It's not about inequality. So we can maybe, not about income inequality measured in cross-section, but it's actually, so this is really hard. I have to go up there and then come back down here.
Making it from the bottom to the top. How mobile is society? How far does where you're born on the ladder affect where you end up on the ladder? So in a perfectly mobile society, an opportunity utopia, being born down here in the bottom quintile would have no effect on where you ended up. You'd be equally likely to make it to the top as to stay at the bottom. But now I want to show you what it's really like. Right now, for the people born at the bottom, more than 1 in 3 of them will remain stuck at the bottom, and just 1 in 10 are going to make it.
Oh, really have not mastered this at all, I apologise. It is slightly tricky, but I wanted to make the point that, oh, have I gone back? Okay, I'll shoot forward. The numbers are slightly different to the ones you just saw, because different data sources will give you slightly different outcomes. So just wanted to point that out. And now I have to go up here. Look at that. All right, we're about here, I think. No, we're about here. About here. It's not very interesting anyway, so let's start here.
The bottom and the top. And it's more, what are your chances of making it from the bottom to the top? How mobile is society? How far does where you're born on the ladder affect stay at the bottom? But now I want to show you what it's really like. Right now, for the people born at the bottom, more than 1 in 3 of them will remain stuck at the bottom, and just 1 in 10 are going to make it all the way up to the top. That's bad enough, but it's even worse for certain groups in the population. If you were born in the bottom quintile and you're a black American, you have a 50% chance of remaining stuck at the bottom and just a 3% chance of making it Horatio Alger style all the way to the top. So this is the picture for black America. For white Americans, the picture looks close to that utopia with roughly the same chances of making it to the top of the distribution as of being stuck at the bottom. Those who are born at the bottom and are raised by parents who are never married. And for that group, the odds of making it to the top are pretty slim as well. For them, it looks like this. For those raised by married parents, it looks like this. Again, it's pretty close to what you might hope for in a perfectly mobile society. Those who are born at the bottom, if they're raised by married parents, have a pretty good chance of making it to the top. So if you don't complete high school, there's a 50% chance you're going to stay stuck at the bottom if you were born at the bottom, and a 1% chance that you're going to make it to the top 20% of the income distribution as an adult yourself. So for them, it looks like this. If you're born at the bottom, born in this bottom fifth, but you're one of the few born down here who managed to get a 4-year college degree, transforms your chances of moving up the income distribution. Go to college. We can have a long argument about the gap between the rich and the poor, but I think we can all agree that we don't want to live in a society where you're born determines so strongly your chances in life of where you end up. America has a dream of equal opportunity, And we're a very long way right now from that dream. We have a big problem, and we need big solutions.
All right, okay. Okay, so I have, thank you. I have a friend who's also got a video at Brookings, and we have a bet as to who can get the most views by the end of this year. So I feel that if you want to look at that again, you should. And maybe again and again. The only thing is that if you do it from the same device, it doesn't count. So ideally, just once from your phone, maybe once from your laptop. Tell your friends, put it on Facebook, etc. Just know them to win this. So I cheated a little bit there, and I'm going to explain a couple of ways in which I cheated just to try and get it across. But I still think, and I can't take much credit for it, I think he does quite a good job of explaining this whole idea of relative mobility, the extent to which kind of being stuck at the bottom in particular. I didn't really talk there about being stuck at the top, but I will talk about that in the course of my comments now. All right, I think these ideas of absolute and relative mobility are kind of related. So remember, absolute mobility is, are you better off than the previous generation? Are you doing better than your parents were at the same age? Is the economy growing? And are the proceeds of growth being shared around? You know, I think you could pretty good sense that that was happening. Between 1950 and 1973, the US economy grew at an average of 4% a year. So no wonder people felt better off at the end of that 25-year period. And for many of the post-war decades, not only in the US, but particularly in the US, there's massive economic growth. And what that means is that the generation that did best from that growth were hugely better off than their previous generation. And so there's a lot of upwardly mobile people in that sense. Unsurprisingly, if you get 25 years of strong growth. Growth has slowed now, and so you won't see quite the same absolute mobility. Relative mobility is this zero-sum game where we're kind of moving up and down. But I think they're related. And this is actually an image that Steve Pearlstein, who writes for the Washington Post and teaches at George Mason, gave me, which is to kind of think about absolute mobility as being on an open road. Everyone's going somewhere. We're all driving along at 50, 60 miles per hour. And if everyone's going somewhere, if someone overtakes you, if someone ends up doing a bit better than you, relatively speaking, you don't mind so much, maybe, because we're all going somewhere. And so maybe we don't mind so much the idea that we might be downwardly mobile, or our kids will be downwardly mobile, and they'll get overtaken by other people, if we're all going at a reasonable speed. In other words, if absolute mobility is reasonably strong. But if you enter an era of much lower growth, there isn't this sense that everyone's getting ahead in the same way, then the fairness of the outcomes, the extent to which relative mobility, there's this movement up and down, might become more important. Then it looks a bit more like this. Then it's a bit more gridlocked, right? If you're in a low-growth economy with less absolute mobility, it's not the case that we're all getting somewhere better, then it might start to matter a bit more that where the place you occupy in the queue is fairly got by. How angry do you get if you've been sitting in a jam for a while and then someone cuts in? Comes down the outside lane and cuts in. Feels unfair. Feels like they're cheating kind of in some way. And that's, I think, what's maybe starting to happen a little bit now is that as we're growing less, and there's this sense of kind of much more stagnant growth, especially for those in the middle of the distribution, that actually where you end up on the ladder starts to matter quite a bit more. If everyone's getting better off, maybe it doesn't matter so much. And so I think that relative mobility actually becomes more important in an era of lower absolute mobility. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the factors that lie behind that stickiness at the bottom. And I did this in the video, but I'm just going to do it in a tiny bit more detail. And I kind of think of these 4 factors that explain stickiness, lack of mobility, relative mobility. And this is how I kind of summarize them. Kind of, FERG is one way to kind of think about it. Family, education, race, and geography. So I'd already done the marriage thing, and you sort of saw that. So this is the comparison that I used in the video, and here I'm drawing on Bell's work, and in fact I'm drawing on data from model, the social genome model that Bell created, one of the things that attracted me to Brookings. And here what we're looking at is a slightly fuller picture than what you saw in the video, which is if your mother wasn't married at all through your childhood, these are what your outcomes are. And the reason that we don't have those top 2 quintiles is there aren't enough people at the top of the distribution to make a child. So we can only do those bottom 3. They're all poor. And then the ones on the right are the ones whose mothers were married throughout their childhood, which almost certainly means they were with both their biological parents throughout their childhood. There's a group in the middle I'm not showing where they were married for some of the time who are about halfway between the two. What that shows is, no, even for those who were born in the same part of the distribution, the bottom 20%, very different outcomes. Now, the question then becomes why? What's going on there? It's partly money, even within the quintiles, but we do know that family stability is hugely important. And I think we do know now that in the US anyway, there is a relationship between marriage and stability. It's less true in other countries. And as a recovering European liberal, one of the things that I've really struggled with is the role of marriage in American society. And it's something that Belle and I have talked a lot about and Belle's kind of written about. But the evidence is very strong that stability is what matters. And marriage is a way that Americans achieve that stability. Less true in other nations. And the fact that so many educated Americans are still getting married, and the fact the more educated you are, the more likely you are to get and stay married, tells me there's something quite interesting going on around marriage. And I now think that marriage is becoming a way in which people contract together to raise their kids together. It's become less an economic institution and more a social institution for raising kids together. And you see that in the mobility outcomes. So it's a kind of combination of the parenting and the kind of commitment that is symbolized by the marriage. This does not mean that if we just marched everybody down the aisle and made them get married, they'd all instantly have these outcomes. There's cause and effect here. What's happening is that the people who are committed to raising their kids together get married. So marriage is the expression of that commitment. Now, I showed you the high school ones. So if you don't finish high school, this is you're stuffed. This is looking back. Now you'd need more than that. Sorry, do you say that? Do you say stuffed? You don't, do you? Screwed? Is that rude? Oh, is that rude, though? No? Okay. I have real problems with my language sometimes. One of the early conversations I had with Belle, I said, look, Belle, just tell me if I'm teaching grandmother to suck eggs here. Everybody in Britain knows what that means. So I'll explain later. Why does Granny even have eggs? Why does she want to suck them? Okay. But you'll also see, look across the quintiles. So on the right-hand bar, that's the kids who are born in the top 20%. So they're born, let's call it rich for now, born rich, don't finish high school. They're much more likely to be downwardly mobile. 16% of them fall all the way down, as opposed to the 14% who stay at the top. But still, you know, it's not as if income doesn't matter anymore. So if you're going to drop out of high school, make sure your parents are rich. These are high school graduates, which are somewhere in between, and then the ones I showed, which is college graduates. So you see these hugely different outcomes. But again, look to the right, the kids who are born rich and have college degrees, again, their outcomes are good. The bottom left-hand corner, 16% again, that is kids who are born poor who get a 4-year college degree. 16% of them still stay at the bottom. Remember that? Bottom right-hand corner, 16% of the kids who are born to rich parents who don't even finish high school fall to the bottom. So I'm just making the point that whilst education is hugely important, it certainly doesn't wipe out the effects of family income. Now, so college, a 4-year college degree is like almost nothing else in terms of public policy interventions around upward mobility. Look at those kids who are born poor. Look at where they end up. More of them end up at the top than get stuck at the bottom. 20% make it to the top. Amazing. So a 4-year college degree is this kind of like magic mobility thing. The trouble is, very few kids from that quintile get that. So of those who do, that's the outcome. Colleges for affluent Americans. This shows, again, its income quintiles from the poorest to the richest on the right. And these are people who were 25 or above in the late 70s or the mid-90s. So the bars, the light blue bars on the right are the younger generation. And what you can see is that all income groups have seen an increase in your chances of getting a 4-year college degree. So one kind of politician could say, everybody's going to college. Look at these poor kids. We've almost tripled the chances of poor kids getting a college degree. Isn't that amazing? But actually what's happened over on the right is just as interesting, which is that among those who are born in 4th or 5th quintile, in the top 40% of the income distribution, certainly for those at the top, college degrees become the norm. Most kids from the top 20% get a 4-year college degree. I have no idea where all of you are on the income distribution, but you may well be towards that right-hand side in which it's a given that your kids will get a 4-year college degree or that you got a 4-year college degree. It's almost not a choice. It's just what everyone does. And that has become very strongly the case. And so actually the gap between rich and poor in terms of college completion has not changed at all. And in fact, the way that college operates now in the US is very often to cement that status at the top. So remember that college has this huge effect on upward mobility, but now look who's getting those 4-year college degrees. And also, at the risk of digression, it's even more important if your child is not that academically strong that they get a 4-year college degree. The evidence is that kids who are not as academically strong in adolescence are much less likely to fall down the distribution if they got a 4-year college degree. And so if you have 2 children and you can only afford to send one of them to college, send the stupid one. The smart one will do fine anyway. But the one who's stupid, that's not a very nice thing to say, is it? well, I don't know what the politically correct term is now, whatever, the less academically challenged one or whatever, something. Anyway, they're the ones that need the college degree, because by the time their employers find out that they're not all that, it'll be too late. They'll be safely ensconced in the upper middle class. Middle of management or something. Right, and then I mentioned race, and this is a huge issue. When we first produced some of these numbers, we get a lot of pushback. I think, if anything, the recent evidence is that the race gaps are even bigger than we thought. Here we just present black and white where we have enough data. So here I showed you what happened to the bottom quintile kids, that if you're born poor and black, 50% chance of staying poor as an adult. If you're born poor and white, 23% chance. So you're twice as likely to be stuck in poverty if you're poor and black as if you're poor and white. These are just descriptive statistics, by the way. It's also the case that African American kids are much more likely to be being raised by a single parent. So part of the explanation lies in sort of previous graphs. They're also less likely to have finished high school. So all of these things overlap with each other. But I want to draw your attention to the middle quintile. So this is people who are right in the middle of the income distribution, the middle 20% when they were born. So you look at the black kids first and see where they end up. 32% of the ones born in the middle drop to the bottom. 37% drop 1. And only 8% make it up. So most of the kids who are born into the middle of the distribution who are black fall. Now look at the white third quintile over on the right. Look what happens to them. So I'm reading down it. 21, 23, 23, 20, 14. So it is not only that black kids are twice as likely to be stuck in poverty if they're born poor. It is that black kids who are born into the middle class, or whose parents were of middle income, are twice as likely to be downwardly mobile as white kids. And in some ways, I find that an even more disturbing finding, which we may get a chance to talk about. But you can't talk about the lack of intergenerational mobility in the US without talking about race, and in particular without talking about the differential experience for black Americans. Being black and poor is not the same as being white and poor in America. And then the fourth is geography. And again, I'm working here from a groundbreaking study by Raj Chetty, who was formerly of Harvard, now at Stanford. It's always upsetting if you have any scholarly pretensions at all to say this, but he's really, I think, changed the way we think about this field, because he had a huge data set, tax data, which allowed him to look at it geographically. This is a different measure. Here he's using a correlation between parents' income and kids' incomes. And basically, what you need to know for the purpose of this is that the darker the area, the worse the mobility, the less mobility there is. And you'll probably notice a pattern, and those of you who know your history will see that it will correlate with certain parts of history. Older places are less mobile, and the South in particular has terrible mobility rates. So what we've learned is when we talk about mobility and opportunity, we can't talk about the US just as the US. We have to say, well, why are they doing so well in Utah and so badly in Charlotte? Because there are some parts of the US that have very good rates of mobility, Scandinavian rates of mobility. And there are other parts of the US where your chances of being stuck at the bottom are higher than almost anywhere else you can measure. And so there's huge variation within the US as well. It's increasingly a metro issue and a regional issue as we kind of think about it. So those are the kind of main, those four elements are what explain a lot of this stickiness that we see in the US distribution intergenerationally. So born poor, staying poor. And now I want to talk a little bit about income inequality as well. So far I've been talking about this intergenerational mobility, this idea of kind of, how you move up and down. But obviously a big part of the story of recent years is the rise in income inequality. Just at any moment in time, how is one group doing by comparison to the others? And of course the Occupy Wall Street movement and so on, and many others have drawn attention to the rise of the top 1%. And so what we show here is, since 1979, the real terms change over time. So this is the average household income for people in different parts of the distribution in 2011 dollars. And that top line is the top 1%. And you can see that there's been a very significant increase in their real household income in those years. And the increase in inequality in the US is very much top heavy. It's very much the pulling away of the top. And then the line below them is the 81st, the 99th percentile. In other words, that's the 19% just below the top 1%. So I've taken that top quintile and broken it in half, so there's a top 1%, but what about the 19% below them? So still at the top, but not really at the top. And on this graph, it doesn't look like they've been doing it. It looks like everyone else is in the same boat. All right, it's the top 1%. But that's partly because the top 1% have so much money that I've had to stretch the left-hand axis up to $2 million. And so that necessarily compresses everybody else. And so for the next graph, what I do is take the top 1% out altogether, forget about the top 1%, but show the top 19%. So this shows me what's happened at the same time period using the same measure to the bottom 40, so I've put the 40% together, the middle 40%, and then this group, the 19% just below the top 1%, and the same increase. And guess what I've had to do? Change the left-hand scale. Now I only need to go up to a mere $200,000 real income, household income a year. And I think that what that shows is that this is not just about the top 1%. Actually, the 19% below the top 1%, those who are in that top quintile, have been doing pretty well in the last 2 or 3 decades. For a household income, now if you've got 2 adults and 2 kids, if you've got something about 110,000, I'm kind of looking at Bell, would probably put you in that top quintile. 6 figures and a bit is kind of the entry point. It's adjusted for family size, so it depends how many people are in the household. If you're in that group, I'm definitely in that group. We're doing pretty well. And actually, the tax burden is not fairly shared in the US. And I think that one of the problems is that those people who are maybe not in the top 1%, but are certainly in the top 20%, and many of them have managed to convince themselves that the inequality problem is just the top 1%, and that they are not part of the problem. They are, if anything, feeling slightly poor by comparison to the top 1%. But I can assure you that that feeling goes all the way up the distribution. Within the top 1%, and I did a thing for the Daily Show about this, there's some evidence that it's the top 0.1% that are doing really well. And then within that, the top 0.001% who are doing really well. And so all that happens is that the people who have to sort of fly first class are insanely envious of the people with a private jet or net jets. And then they get insanely envious of the person with another jet. And as someone who's a super gazillionaire explained to me, it never ends. He told me that he just had a very difficult moment going to Aspen, actually. Bella and I were just talking about Aspen, where he explained that there's a problem. You fly from Europe to Aspen. I'm pretty sure it's Aspen. And Aspen's got quite a small runway. I've never been to Aspen. It's got a short runway, so you can't put big planes down in Aspen. And so the problem is you're flying from Europe. I mean, I say problem in inverted commas here. You're flying from Europe to a high-level conference in Aspen, and it's a long way from Europe, so you want to bring the big jet so that you're comfortable. But if you bring the big jet, you can't land in Aspen. You have to land in Denver, somewhere with a longer runway, and then you have to drive from there to Aspen. Anyway, this guy was complaining about this. And he just said, it's a pain, you know, because you bring the big jet, you don't want to be in the small jet. And he said, this other guy said, what are you talking about? I just have a follower jet. He said, what's a follower jet? This guy's like, everyone has a follower jet. You fly in the big jet, over from Europe, land in wherever it is, Denver, but the small jet follows you. The small jet comes behind you. You get out of the big jet, walk over to the small jet, and then the small jet flies you to Aspen. This guy said, I suddenly realized I don't have a follower jet. I was like, welcome to the middle class, mate. Not everyone has a follower jet. You know, there are some people who share private jets, net jets or something. I mean, it's tough up there. So my point, although I'm making think about it, is the real separation. There's been separation all the way up to the top. But a real separation has occurred around this top quintile point. And I think you can see that, and I could show you many, many other graphs that kind of make that point. That actually this group, call them the upper middle class, have done pretty well. And yet many of them don't feel like they have. At one of the May Day demonstrations at Occupy Wall Street, a third of the people there had an income of more than $100,000 a year. And they were protesting about inequality. Okay, look, I'm not suggesting that 100,000 is the same in New York as it is somewhere else. I'm not suggesting that there aren't people in New York who are making a lot more than them. But I think we've lost sight of something if we really kid ourselves that we are the bottom 99%. I think that that's an absurd and a regressive thing to think, when all the evidence suggests that there are many people well below the 1% that are doing pretty nicely, thank you very much. And yet, when you try and take stuff away from us, or ask us to pay more in taxes, because we've convinced ourselves that whilst the rich are getting away with it, we are not rich. We resist. And so one of the things I talk about at the beginning of my book, which no one gets a free copy of, is Obama's embarrassment in his budget in 2014 rather. So Obama proposed a policy which was sensible. Every policy wonk thinks you should have done it on paper. We agreed with it. It's progressive. It would have promoted college going, probably, among kind of poorer kids. It was budget neutral, so it didn't cost anything. Great idea. And yet, for the first time in living political memory, the president had to withdraw it from his own budget before it even got to Congress. And he did so under pressure from some of the most liberal members of his own party, Nancy Pelosi and Chris Van Hollen. Nancy Pelosi was flying with the president at the time. Chris Van Hollen got Nancy Pelosi on the telephone and said, you have to get him to drop this policy. It's killing us. It's crazy. So it wasn't the Republicans that killed it. Republicans hated it, but it was Democrats that killed the policy. So Obama's spokesman had to come out and say it had been a distraction and asked his own members not to vote for it. Bear in mind, this is a budget that wasn't going to pass anyway, right? It wasn't real, and so you're taking something out of a budget that wasn't going to pass anyway. What was that policy? Does anyone know? Anyone remember? I know Bell knows, so it doesn't count. Does anybody know what the policy was that he had to take out of his own budget that was so unpopular? Does anybody know what a 529 college saving plan is? Hands up here who has either had or is paying into a 529 college saving plan. Hands up. Okay. That's more than the average. 529 college, they're tax-efficient ways to save for college. The capital gain is not taxed, and many states add on top of it. And Obama proposed to get rid of them for the future and instead use the revenue to fund tax credits for lower income kids because it's a regressive policy. And this is not quintiles, this is quartiles. This is how CBO do it. But, so you've got the poorest quarter of the population to the richest quarter of the population, and you can break that down as well. And this is how many people in each of those income brackets have a 529 plan. You can start to see why it's not a brilliantly progressive way to spend public money. Because it's predominantly those towards the right who have it. It's still a minority of even them. But if you get up to the 90th percentile, it's even more. And basically nobody in the bottom half. In fact, in this survey from which they drew this, in order to get that estimate there for the bottom quartile, the sample size is one person. They found one person. So one of the things I've told my researchers to do is find that person. Who is that person they found in a survey who's below, is in the bottom quarter and is saving into their 529 plan? That's an amazing person. Then there's a separate question as to how much money is in those. Using the same kind of distribution, this is the average balance. So of those who have a plan now, right? So you're only looking at those who have a plan, how much is in it? And you can see that for those to the right, top quartile, the average is 35,000. For the top 1%, it's about 100,000. They have 100,000 in their average 529 plan. And then for the one person who we found in that bottom quartile, that one person's got $3,000 in their 529 plan. And then you can see those in the middle don't either. So 529 college savings plans are basically a way in which the federal government subsidizes affluent people to do something that they were going to do anyway, which is save for their kids' retirement. It is massively regressive. It is totally unconscionable. And yet it couldn't possibly pass politically to get rid of it because it touched something sacred, which was the rights of the upper middle class to get tax breaks on sending their kids to college. And I genuinely think that part of the reason for that is because many of us who are in that income bracket have convinced ourselves that we're the losers in the inequality game, rather than, as I think, closer to being the winners. And that's always an uncomfortable thought. Those of us who work on inequality issues, it's much easier for us to talk about poor people and the problems of poverty, or to talk about the super rich. In other words, either to look down or up the income distribution. It's very much harder to look in the mirror and wonder if actually we're part of the problem and we need to behave differently and we need to think differently about redistribution rather than just saying, oh, it's those rich people. So I strongly encourage all of you to see where you are on the income distribution. Very often the results are surprising. Most people find that they're higher than they thought they were when they actually do the calculations, and there's lots of ways to do that. And then the last thing is just a kind of a quick preview of my book, which relates to this issue of the upper middle class. I don't think that we're quite content just to be taking the money that we are and resisting tax breaks. I think that we also cheat. And we cheat on behalf of our children. All parents want their kids to do well, and it's fine. We should do that, and we should encourage more parents to do it. But that's not quite enough. And so there are a few ways, and Belle and I have had an argument about this in the last 24 hours. Some of these are maybe quite trivial in their effects empirically, but I think they're quite important symbolically, because I think they speak to a nation that's kind of giving up on the idea of genuine meritocracy. If we allow some of these things to happen, then really, are we going to make the other changes? And so some of the ones I'm going to talk about in my book are exclusionary zoning policies, whereby people who live in affluent areas with great public schools effectively zone out lower income people from joining them or their kids from joining our kids in our schools by using zoning policies that, if we're really honest, are really just about protecting our own housing wealth and our own kids' schools. And I think that in many cases that's simply unconscionable and effectively cheating the system. And there are other small examples like legacy admissions, something that Europeans who still can't quite get their head around, that if your parents went to Harvard, you've got a 30% chance of getting in. If they didn't, you've got a 6% chance of getting in. Notre Dame, it's even bigger gap. And there is, again, small numbers that are involved. But it does seem to me that if not even willing to challenge some of those small symbolic departures from the idea of equal opportunity, then the hopes for the kind of radical reforms that Bell would argue for are diminished too. And I would say even in some of the ways in which internship opportunities, which are becoming more important, are being handed out very often through social networks, social connections and so on. They're unfair too, because they're a scarce good. And so if you get a great internship at someone like Brookings, for example, I don't think for a moment you should get that because you know me, because you live in Bethesda Chevy Chase and your kids go to the same affluent public high school that my kids go to. I think you should get it through a fair selection process, because an internship at Brookings is vital currency in the labour market. And so we shouldn't just be handing those out on a grace and favour basis. We should be handing them out meritocratically. Again, might seem like small beer, but it does seem to me to be symptomatic of a society that's actually coming to terms with inequality and feeling quite comfortable with inequality. Or rather, I should say, those of us who are at the top of the distribution are too comfortable with inequality and too willing to blame others, rather than take our own responsibilities, and in particular to bear a share of burden of taxes. And so I've written about that in a book, which is coming out shortly when I finish it. It's coming out from Brookings Press next year. It's called Dream Hoarders. And it's about this issue of kind of the upper middle class, which is essentially this idea the American dream is alive and well, but only at the top. Only for us, not for other people. And I think that might explain quite a bit about the current political mood and where things are potentially heading. And I also blog and tweet and have a newsletter. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you. I'm now very happy to take questions.
Richard, that was terrific, except for all those embarrassing things you said about me. One question here is about international comparisons.
Sure.
So you talked about mobility in the
Can everyone hear?
US.
Can everyone hear, Bill? No, you have to use this. You have to use this.
Do I need to?
Because I've got a...
Oh, because you've got a, okay.
I might, so.
Is it, I don't know how to get it out.
Teamwork.
Takes a man.
Teamwork. Never thought I'd hear you say that, Smell. Yes, international comparisons.
Yeah, but I have to go back to the question about international comparisons. The U.S. does not have, despite the American dream as a phrase, and despite the Horatio Alger stories, where we think that we are the land of opportunity. Is it true?
No. On most measures of relative mobility, which is what I focused on here, the US does quite badly by comparison to other countries. So the UK, for example, has more mobility, and in particular, it has more downward mobility. So where the US really stands out is this top right-hand corner, where the American top quintile are better at perpetuating their status across generations than elsewhere. So if you're looking for a society where posh people produce posh children, then look at your own, not mine. Just statistically speaking, it's more true of that. I think it's harder with the upward mobility thing to kind of make a distinction. And where a place that's really amazing, this is the most embarrassing thing of all, perhaps, is that there's quite good mobility rates in Canada. So if that doesn't galvanize action, I don't know what will.
One question here is about to what extent is this about money? And what about the people who don't care that much about money and want to be artists or musicians or follow some other kind of dream? And what do we know about the relationship between money and happiness?
Great question. So my view about the relationship between money and happiness, and I think Bell and I slightly differ on this, is that it's a pretty robust relationship most of the way up the distribution. You do need more money as you get towards the top. You need to follow a jet, not just a jet. And that's expensive. So if you're already a millionaire, it takes a lot of money to make you happier. But I still think there's a relationship. I think that the problem with the way we present the data, and I present it, is that we're using income all the time, as if income is the only measure of success. Why do we do that? A, because we've got the data for that. It's very hard to measure people's satisfaction or well-being in the same way. Also, most people do want higher incomes. So it seems to be about preference satisfaction. But I do think that when it comes to things like downward mobility, for example, it's quite interesting to compare what are the upwardly mobile professions and which are the downwardly mobile professions. So the best thing to do if you're born poor is to become a nurse. I say best thing in the sense that that's the occupation that shows the most upward mobility. Now look at people who are downwardly mobile, so they're born at the top, but they end up somewhere, say, in the middle. What do? Because they should have become doctors and lawyers and stuff, or investment bankers. But they didn't, and the things they do are just what you said, Belle. They become artists, or musicians, or they run art galleries, or things like that, and so they end up falling down the income distribution. And I don't worry too much about those people, because I think they probably make a conscious choice. Yes, my parents were affluent, and it may be one of the reasons they had all the chances to develop those skills in the first place. They're then choosing to use them in a different way and not judge themselves by income. I don't worry so much about those people, if that's a kind of conscious choice. The difficult thing is we don't know. And right now, enough people at the bottom would say they'd like to go up, that income remains an important measure.
I have a question here about other routes to upward mobility other than going to college and getting a 4-year degree. What about apprenticeships and other kinds of training? Do we need more of that?
Hugely more of that. I think one of the problems with the college thing, go to college message, and I just reinforced that, and in fact I think I got it slightly wrong in the video, I said go to college, is that it's very unitary. It's very like this is the only way to go. And what that's meant is a lot of people have gone to really bad colleges, taken on a lot of debt, and dropped out. And that's partly because of the absence of good quality alternatives. And so I think it's better, I'm borrowing from a book called Bottlenecks here, it's better to think about opportunity pluralism. Are there lots of different ways to get to the top? Why is it this unitary, you've got to get a 4-year college degree thing? And it's partly because the investment in quality vocational education is so poor in the US that actually if I'm candidly advising people, including my own kids, but kids I know, in the US right now, I would say get a 4-year college degree because right now that is the respected credential. So it's a vicious circle. And I will say this, that whilst I think we do need more vocational education, and I don't think college is for everybody, one of the things that troubles me is that when you're with a predominantly professional or upper middle class audience and they talk about vocational education, they're always talking about somebody else's kids. They're almost never talking about their own. If you say to them, so, is your kid going to do an apprenticeship then? Is your kid going to go to community college to do a vocation? No, oh God, no, they're going to Yale or University of Maryland. No, I'm not talking about my kids, I'm talking about their kids. And so I think that's a bit of a vicious circle as well. And one of the reasons I'm reluctant to give up too much on the college message, and again, it's something Belle and I talk about, is because I'm afraid that as long as all of us are still pushing our kids through the higher education system, it will remain something that stratifies. It's not to say we shouldn't do more on the vocational side, but we've got to do both. I don't want us to take off the gas. And right now, so few poor kids get a real chance to go to 4-year colleges that we've got to do that at the same time as investing more in vocational. And when I'm ready to say, yeah, my kid's doing an apprenticeship, I'll relax a bit. But I'm not ready to say that yet. I don't know how many of you are, but...
Okay, here comes a zinger from your last answer. Are you willing to send your own kids to a school where all the other kids are low income?
No. And I think I actually met a woman who did that. She lives in DC, she has a good income, and she's deliberately stayed in a catchment area of a very, very bad high school and sent her daughter there. She feels she has a moral responsibility to do that. Because if all the upper middle class parents take the kids away, then it remains a sink school and it won't get any better. And I had two thoughts. Wow, admiration. And secondly, wow, what a terrible parent. And I mean that. I actually think that there's a difficult balance here to be struck. And I certainly would argue against exclusionary zoning, and I am doing so. In fact, where I live is quite inclusive in terms of zoning. And I would argue against all the other things that I've done. But a parent who has the choice to get a better education for the kids and chooses a bad education for their kids is a parent who's using their child as a social policy intervention. And I don't think that's morally justified either. These are difficult choices, but I think to deliberately damage your own kids' life chances as a political act suggests to me that even though you might be a model citizen, there's something slightly lacking in you as a parent.
You haven't said much about women. You talked about race and family structure and marriage and geography. How do women do on the mobility front relative to men?
Well,
And part of the question here is just about wage gaps, too.
right. Well, this is a bit weird because Belle knows the answer to this way better than me. So I'll have a go at it, and then you can tell me if it's right or wrong. So the evidence is that the gender gap in mobility is narrowing as more and more women have gone into the labour market, got more education, and been able to be more upwardly mobile. And what's happening now is something interesting, and it speaks again a lot to your work, Belle, is that one of the reasons why women who have good education and decent income or earnings power themselves are doing well is because they are marrying or partnering with men who are also high income and highly educated. There's this phrase called assortative mating, which is the least romantic term imaginable for marrying someone like yourself. And what that means is that at a household level, these households are doing very well indeed, which means that the women themselves are actually pretty upwardly mobile by comparison to their backgrounds. But it's not only because of women's wages, it's because the women are combining their incomes with the incomes of high-income, well-educated men. And so at a household level, the income gap gets great, which is not to say that there isn't still a significant problem with the earnings gap and with the wage gap, although that has become a more interesting question as to why we're seeing that over time. And it's basically gradually less straightforward discrimination and more about occupation and occupational divisions between the two. But I see the gender gaps narrowing even as the class gaps widen, partly because there's a lot more upper middle class women now. And now, for every 5 people who graduate four-year college, 3 of them are women. So there are many more American women graduating than American men graduating. So I think that trend is going to increase.
This person wants to know to what extent mobility is about something we can address with public policy and something that is more connected to human nature. I think what you, Richard, would call character or something else.
Well, that's a great question. Was that your question?
No, no. I'm actually playing straight tonight.
All right, okay. It sounds like a very hard question. Well, the first thing to say is that what you might call character or soft skills aren't necessarily immune to public policy. I think the sorts of skills that we might be talking about, the ability to kind of stay on task, defer gratification and so on, which as parents we tend to try and instill in our own children. I think there's some evidence that particular types of high school education, for example, some of the KIPP schools are very strong on this. And they explicitly talk about character. They talk about the marshmallow. You know, don't eat the marshmallow. We'll talk about that. There isn't time to get into the marshmallow, but don't eat the marshmallow. So I don't think, but having said that, I think we have to be, as public policy people, we have to be quite humble about the limits to public policy as well. Quite a lot of this is happening at a family level and at a community level. And I think quite a lot of this is about social norms and values as much as it is about a particular tax or a particular funding mechanism. So I think that, for example, the way you think about, I don't know, zoning, just to take one of the examples that we kind of looked at, is that actually that's as much a cultural issue. You know, if you think you have every right to keep out, you know, people who aren't wealthy because that's going to protect your house value and your kids, and you think that's fine and morally justified, then it'll be very hard to find policies that overcome that. And the truth is, it is very hard to find policies that overcome those sorts of problems. And I think that the cultural change and some of the changes around attitudes and social norms almost have to precede that. Can public policy change social norms? Well, that's another kind of interesting question. So I don't think you can solve all these quintile transition matrices with a wheezy policy that we come up with at Brookings or anywhere else. And some of them now, I think, are as much about culture as they are about policy. But I do think that some of the straightforward questions around distributive justice and the way the tax system works and the way the education system works, we can do. And so we shouldn't allow the fact that we will never achieve everything stop us from trying to achieve what we can achieve. Because even if that policy only makes a 2% difference, and that policy makes a 1% difference, and that policy makes a 3% difference, you know what, if you do all of those, you've made a 6% difference. Thank you. You can see why I'm not actually an economist. I think that on the one hand, some people say, oh, public policy doesn't work. Doesn't matter, war on poverty failed, nothing works, you can't reform K-12, let's just all give up, pack up and go home. And there's another group who are saying, you can solve everything. All we need is early years education, universal pre-K, and we'll close the opportunity gap. Doesn't matter about parents or communities, right? And both sides are equally wrong.
You're going to think that this is my question, so I'm going to actually read it.
Okay, no. I'll
To
suspend
prove to
my
you-
disbelief. I'll suspend it.
Because we talked about this at lunch today.
Oh, okay, right.
With the decrease in the size and purchasing power of the middle class, do you think that leads to slower economic growth?
It's really hard, this, because again, Belle's better equipped to answer this than me. I don't think we know yet. The best evidence, I think, so far about the relationship between income inequality and economic growth suggests that it is unproven in either direction. So it is not the case that more unequal societies grow really quickly. That was probably part of the arguments for, yeah, sure, there's a big gap between rich and poor, but that incentivizes people and we all make more money and yet wealth creators and it trickles down. No, it doesn't. But also the kinds of arguments which tend to come from the left, which is income inequality is bad because it depresses consumption and if we didn't have so much inequality, we'd be growing faster. The international and historical evidence of that is currently weak. However, just because we can't prove that it's happened yet, doesn't mean it might not happen. And I think there is at least suggestive evidence now that the shape of the income distribution and the way the proceeds of growth are being spent could mean that the current shape of inequality will have an effect for economic growth going forward. I would simply say that I don't think I need that argument to make my argument for greater equality. And I think it's a political mistake to say we need less inequality because then we'll grow faster. Because what if that turns out not to be true? Do you just say then, oh, well, don't worry about inequality then? Oh, okay, fine. If it doesn't affect economic growth, you've conceded too much ground because economic growth isn't everything. What also matters is how the growth is spread. What also matters is well-being. What also matters is freedom. What also matters is substantive opportunity. And so by saying by making it about growth, you concede too much ground, it seems to me. It's better to make an argument for equality, which is about equality and the kind of society you want to live in. Make a strong moral argument, not a weak economic argument.
Maybe one more question, which is a very big and important one, and that is, are you going to suggest any solutions in your new book? Suppose we accept that there is a lot of inequality and that the upper middle class is part of the problem. What should we do about it?
Well, yes, and it's one of the things that you and I were talking about last night. And in fact, again, that wasn't you? That wasn't your... Belle was saying last night, you must put more solutions in your book. So now I'm getting questions. Are you going to have actual solutions in your book? Now I am really suspicious. Yes. And I think there are obvious ones around some of the issues we talked about, distribution, and the way that the current US tax system is upside down. It never ceases to amaze me how much money the federal government seems to think it needs to give me when I fill out my taxes. It's just extraordinary. And for the kinds of things it's willing to give me money for, it's absolutely bonkers. And so I think the distribution of tax, and Bill Gale, a colleague of ours at Brookings, has a book coming out on that. Straightforward. I think some of the reforms around higher education and the way higher education is funded, they will be in there too. But I shouldn't overpromise, because the two things I want to do really in the book are one of the things I tried to do tonight, which is don't just automatically assume the inequality problem isn't about you, because too many people are doing that. And the damage of the top 1% or super rich thing is that I think too many of us have let ourselves off the hook in that. I do think that the issue of inequality affects a broader group, and there's a broader group of beneficiaries. And I think unless that realization happens, all of the policies in the world will fail because you won't get political support for them. Look what happened to 529s, which is a straightforwardly simple, good policy. But we couldn't bear to give up that tax break. Do you know how hard it is to save for your kids' college while you're also paying for 2 homes and private school fees? I'm only partly joking. People actually say things like that. And so I do think there's a need for kind of around social norms and kind of culture. And then the thing I touched on here, and again, empirically hard to know how much these things matter. But I do think there are some ways in which some of the ways we enhance our kids' opportunities, most of the ways we do that are fair, legitimate, and human nature. Everybody wants their kids to prosper, and there's something wrong with a parent who doesn't want their kids to prosper and does what's within their power to help them prosper. But there comes a point where our desire for our own kids to do well shouldn't allow us to rig the system in their favor, thereby excluding others from the opportunities they might otherwise have. In just the same way that I want companies to want to be profitable, I don't want them to form cartels or monopolies. I want competition. And just like I don't want anti-competitive practices in our economy, I don't want anti-competitive practices in our society. And some of the things that those of us in the upper middle class do are candidly anti-competitive and cheating. And it means that our kids do better than they should do if we were living in a fairer society at the expense of others. And these are very, very difficult conversations to have, not least with your own kids. But I do think that unless there's a kind of unless we turn the rhetoric of equal opportunity into more and more of a reality for ourselves and embrace our own responsibility for that happening, it's not going to happen as a result of policy wheezes out of Brookings. It comes down to all of us and our own political. Unless we change our attitudes, we'll never change policy. And if I achieve anything, it will be to try and make us see that those responsibilities is real and that it's fine to compete and it's fine to win, but it's not fine to cheat. It seems to me that cheating is the most un-American thing of all. We hate cheats, and I think some of the things we do cheat. And I'm going to Wall Street and kind of the rest of it, but it seems to me that whilst we videotape every touchdown to make sure that people are abiding by the rules, when it comes to our society and our economy, Americans are turning out to be pretty good at cheating. And the problem is that people get hurt by that cheating. It's not just you didn't get a touchdown. It's that a kid who should have got that place or that opportunity didn't get it. And we're not being fair. We're not being fair to the rest of society. And even though those of us who are above that line might feel pretty good about ourselves, we shouldn't really, if one of the reasons we're doing so well is because others are not. Not at least if we actually believe any of that stuff that you've been saying since you founded this great country.
Thank you, Richard, for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you for coming.